Hi everyone, welcome back to part 2 of chapter 46 on animal reproduction. And we ended part 1 at the perfect timing because now we transition into talking about the human reproductive system. And like I said, I have really narrowed down this, simplified this part of it. So we don't have that many more slides to go over before the chapter is done. So bear with me. So let's talk about the male reproductive anatomy first from the human reproductive system. So first of all, in both cases, whether male or female, there are external parts of it and also internal parts of it. Males have more external parts of it, including that they have a scrotum that includes the testes, but the scrotum is considered as external. Testes is still considered as the internal, even though it's outside of their body, but is inside a layer of their body surface. And then penis is also considered as their external organ. Now, penis contains usually spongy erectile tissue, and also that spongy erectile tissue surrounds a tube or passageway called the urethra. And this is something that is different compared to females, is because females don't have any spongy erectile tissue that surrounds the urethra. Um, we also don't we have a much shorter for females, shorter urethra compared to males. Another thing that is different between males and females is that the male's urethra serves as a common passage for both urine and also sperm excretion. So it is the same passageway for both urinary system and reproductive system. So if you look at these two pictures here, this whole thing is the urethra. The blue is the erectile tissue. Same thing here from the side view, where this is the urethra, a lot longer, and is surrounded by the spongy erectile tissue. And then the scrotum is then the layer of skin that serve, and there's muscles in there too. That is a pouch below the penis right there, and it contains the testes. That is very important for the scrotum to serve the role of maintaining stable temperature of the testes. It actually contains some involuntary muscles within there that position the testes either closer or farther away from the body, because testes have to be at a specific temperature in order for them to produce the maximal or the optimal amount of sperm. If temperature or body temperature, excuse me, on another way, if body temperature is increased or decreased by a 1 degree or 2 degrees far off, the sperm production may stop altogether. So then onto the internal organs. So that's why scrotum is important. All right, so internal organs, there are gonads, which we've talked about before, and they produce the sperm. And for humans' case, the gonad is the testes or testicle for singular, testes for plural. And they are also in charge of making reproductive hormones. And there's accessory glands for humans that secrete essential things for the sperm to move or survive in the female reproductive tract. And then there's also a lot of different ducts that help to transport the sperm and also, excrete some secretions to let them continue maturing as it's moving throughout the entire internal part of their reproductive system. Now, for testes, we all know they are the ones that are important for producing, and they are the organ in charge of producing sperm inside the male's body. They're made up of highly coiled tubes. So this is like a cross section of the testicle, and you can see how that there's sections like this. Okay, so if I draw it big, it looks like little sections like this. And within the sections, there's actually specific. I always say they look like little spaghetti noodles, and these spaghetti noodles are all crunched up and sort of all stuffed into those holes or cavities so they can maximize the amount of coils you can have within the testes. Um, and I think they say if you were to pull all those highly coiled tubes out, it can make up the length of 6 meters, which is really long for compacting it into such a tiny organ and structure. So those highly coiled tubes is then called seminiferous tubules. So remember, it ends with tubules because there will be a gland, accessory gland that is called seminiferous vesicle, okay, or seminal vesicle, excuse me, seminal vesicle. So sometimes students confuse between the two. Okay, so seminiferous tubules is what's inside the testicles for producing sperm. Seminal vesicle is an accessory gland that will secrete some sort of, thing that will help the sperm to thrive and move. So most mammals will produce sperm only when testes are cooler than the rest of the body. So this is why, as I've talked about, the scrotum is very important for cooling the testicles so that when it's hot, it tends to descend from the body, allows for more aeration so that it cools down the testicles. And then when it's cold outside, it tends to ascend closer to the body so that it can warm up the testicles. And testicles are constantly in this stabilized temperature homeostasis, and they will be producing the optimal amount of sperm that way. So rodents' testes, compared to humans, they're actually drawn back entirely into their abdominal cavity between breeding seasons. So when it's all the way up into, in their abdominal cavity, it's actually too warm for sperm to be made, which is why when they do that, it actually pause or put a halt on their sperm maturation, or, sort of interrupt their sperm maturation, which in this case, it makes sense. If they're not in the breeding season, don't waste energy to produce all this sperm that is just not going anywhere and going to waste. So that's why in terms of natural selection and adaptation, they have, sort of acquired this feature to save the energy, pause sperm maturation until it's time for breeding season again. For whales and elephants, they actually retain their testes entirely in their abdominal cavity at all times because they have a lower body temperature overall compared to the rest of the animals. And on top of that, they are huge animals, which is why they can have an overall cooler temperature. The smaller you are, the harder it is for you to maintain a specific body temperature. The bigger you are, they're easier to cool down. And on top of that, whales live in the ocean, so they can't be that hot. So, which is why then their testes can reside within the abdominal cavity, stay in there forever because it's at the right temperature for them. Now, from the seminiferous tubules, sperms will then travel through what's called the epididymis, which is this particular structure right here that sits on top of the testicles. That's why it's right on top of it. So the sperm are all being made within these coils, and then it will travel upward to the epididymis right here. And when it goes to epididymis, this is where sperm will complete their maturation process and be able to become motile. Okay, this is where they, in a sense, learn how to swim, is as they are traveling through the epididymis, they acquire those features and they grow to be mature sperms. Once they do that, they will then be propelled through this particular muscular duct called the vas deferens. Okay, so don't confuse this for ureters. This is not a ureter, nor is it a urethra, okay, because it connects to the testicles. It is another duct that connects the epididymis to the outside world, okay, which will merge with the urethra. So vas deferens take those motile mature sperm up and around the bladder, not into the bladder, around the bladder, and eventually it will merge with what's called the ejaculatory duct. So here from the side view, you can see that vas deferens go up and around the bladder, goes into this little portion called the ejaculatory duct, and it is within the ejaculatory duct it kind of gets the secretion from seminal vesicle. That's where the two things merge, and then from the ejaculatory duct, sperm will then travel into the urethra and out into the outside world. Okay, so that's the whole route of sperm from the testicles, seminiferous tubules, into your epididymis, and then goes down to your vas deferens, up over the bladder, not into the bladder, through the ejaculatory duct, get some secretion from 3 glands, okay, down here, also get another secretion from another gland, and then goes through the urethra out of the body, okay? So the 3 glands that I'm talking about is actually the seminal vesicle, prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland. So that's why as sperm is traveling through all these places, it's getting a squirt from seminal vesicle, and then getting some secretion from the prostate, and then getting some secretion from the bulbourethral glands until it makes it out to outside the body. All right, and then here's are then the three accessory glands, and what exactly do they do? It is these three glands, that we can lubricate the sperm with volumes of different nutrient that enable them to move and also survive in the female reproductive tract. This is what we call semen, because sperm are cells, and then it's kind of like red blood cells or erythrocytes in plasma. Now you have sperm cells in semen. So that semen is including everything. All right, so the seminal vesicle usually produces the majority of the volume of the semen, and their secretion mainly contains, it does have a couple things, but I'm simplifying down just to say that they have mainly fructose. So they give that fructose sugar, which is a sugar, to the sperm, because sperm, what it's got to do ever since then they got to swim, especially when they go into the female reproductive tract, that we won't talk about. So I'll kind of talk about it here, mention it really quick. When the sperm enters the female reproductive tract, they're on their own. They got to swim, because if anything, the fluids within the female reproductive tract actually goes against the current. They want them out. So there's fluid that keeps pushing against them. So it's kind of like back to the salmon story where they have to surge against the current. Same thing here. Sperm, us human sperm, also have to go against the current of the female reproductive tract in order to get to the final egg. So this is why they need all the energy they can get. From the seminal vesicle as much as possible, which is why there's fructose in there to give them that energy. And then there's another critical thing called the coagulating enzyme. So we learned about from previous chapters that coagulation means clotting of some sort, and in this case it's not clotting of blood. That makes sure that entire semen remains as a clot, and that clot is what allows all that semen to go inside the female reproductive tract as a whole. Because if it's too liquidy, it might not make it to the right area, and then you can't, you got to be able to make it to a certain point in order for the sperm to start swimming. So if it can't, and everything just comes out, then it won't work. Okay, reproduction and fertilization won't happen. So that's why you need that coagulating enzyme in there. Second accessory gland is prostate gland. So prostate gland has secretion that contains anticoagulant enzyme. You're like, wow, it's kind of like opposite of coagulating. Yes, anticoagulating is opposite of coagulating. So this is what dissolves the clot, because once the clot is inside the female reproductive tract, now it's got to disperse, because all the sperm can't be stuck together in a clot and then they can't go anywhere. Once they're inside the tract in the right location, then they need to start swimming. So this anticoagulant enzyme is then what's going to dissolve the clot and allow the sperm to now be dispersed into their swimming mode. And hopefully they make it all the way up to the oviduct or the fallopian tube, uterine tube, 3 names for that area of the female reproductive tract, and reach their final egg destination. On top of that, prostate gland secretion also includes something called citrates, which is actually a sperm nutrient that will keep the sperm, again, alive and healthy and energized for their upcoming journey. Third and last accessory gland for the male reproductive system is the bulbourethral gland, and very important is because we said that the male's urethra is a shared passage from the urinary system. So urinary bladder is right here, this big thing right there, and it drains urine into the urethra like that. So this passageway can have some acidic urine in there left over from the last time the male urinate. And now that if he is, having sperm come through the same passage area, that acidic urine can actually kill off a portion of the sperm. It does require a certain amount of sperm to get to the female reproductive tract in order to fertilize the egg. Even though only one sperm is all that's necessary for the fertilization to be successful, but to break through the egg, that we won't talk about, but that whole process of breaking through to the egg and letting the sperm fuse with the egg, it's a collaborative effort of at least a dozen sperm in order for that one sperm to make it. Okay. So that's why you need a certain amount. If you're below a certain amount in sperm count, you're considered as infertile because of that fact. Okay, so for the bulbourethral gland, their important job is they secrete this clear mucus before the time it's time for the sperm to come out. They will neutralize any acidic urine that's remaining in the urethra to maximize the chance of survival for all of these sperm, because a whole bunch of it will not survive through just the vagina or even in the uterus of the female reproductive system, because over there is also acidic. So that acidic environment again will kill off some of the sperm. Some of the sperm will also get trapped within the cilia within the female reproductive tract. So a whole bunch of them are gone by the time you get to the female side. All right, so the female reproductive anatomy then is, you have again external parts, which collectively we call this whole area the vulva. And the vulva includes two flaps of tissue. One is called labia majora, one is called labia minora. So this was two sets of labia. So labia majora is the outer thicker layer of adipose tissue, which is fat tissue, that enclose and protect the rest of the vulva. Second layer, inner layer, is the labia minora. So that's the little pink layer right there, that borders your vaginal opening and also your urethral opening. So it's like kind of like a second flap to ensure that there's nothing protect that very fragile sensitive area. Okay, and then you have then the internal organ. Like I said, the female's external organs are very simple. Is majority of the reproductive stuff is inside the body. You just like the male, you have gonads, which then now is the ovaries that produces the egg and also reproductive hormones for females. And then you have a system of ducts and chambers. We don't really have glands for the female reproductive tract. We have a lot of ducts and also the chamber, which is very important for receiving or carrying the gametes through, and also housing the final embryo and fetus, which is why the uterus is like a little home for the next 9 months, or excuse me, 10 months total, 40 weeks for that baby to grow to their full size. All right, so for the ovaries, they're located on either side of the uterus. They're held in place by ligaments, so don't worry, even though they are, technically just two blobs sitting there that look like they're floating, because there is no physical muscles that connect to the ovaries. So the ovaries are just anchored to the uterus by ligaments. So the ovaries won't fall out. They won't shift out of place because they are actually sort of anchored very well into place by a couple ligaments. You don't have to know the name of those ligaments, but there are things that tie them down. All right, and then the outer layer is packed with follicles for these ovaries, and they contain an oocyte, which is a partially developed egg, with surrounding cells that will nourish and protect the oocyte as it grows. And then you have these two tubes, this low tube right here and this tube right here. They are called the oviduct or the fallopian tube or the uterine tube. Now, there's three names for this particular tube. They extend from the uterus towards a funnel-like area. So from the uterus right there goes out to a funnel-like structure called the fimbriae, but you don't have to know that. But it's kind of like a flowery petal thing that kind of hovers over the ovary. It's not a physical connection, like I was saying. It just hovers over it so that when the egg is ovulated, there's cilia on the epithelial lining of the oviduct that will sort of brush and beat the egg in one direction towards the uterus, because we don't want the egg to come outside into the abdominal wall and gets fertilized out here, and then we have a problem of being an ectopic pregnancy. So we want the egg to go rightfully inside the fimbriae, inside the oviduct, and then into the uterus. And then fertilization actually happen within the oviduct, not within the uterus, because there's certain, development that the embryo have to grow till before they're ready for implantation. So if it's here, all the way here for the egg, it's already too late to be fertilized there, because there's not enough time before the embryo, is grow to a point that is ready for implantation into the endometrium lining. So that's why egg optimally needs to be fertilized somewhere up here in the oviduct. So the sperm has to swim all the way from the vagina, it's past the cervix into the uterus against the surge of the cilia for the oviduct to push the egg into the uterus, against that current up into the oviduct and make it to the egg. All right. So the uterus, it's a big, thick, muscular organ that expands, of course, during pregnancy to fit, up to 4 kilograms of baby, or on average 7-pound baby inside the uterus. The inner lining of the uterus is called the endometrium. So that's that. This layer right here is the endometrium, which is it can be thick or thin depending what part of what timing of the menstrual cycle you're in. But when it's thick, it is richly supplied with blood vessels, getting ready for any implantation of a viable embryo. And then the neck of the cervix is called, excuse me, the neck of the cervix. The neck of the uterus is then called the cervix, and it is what opens to the vagina. So cervix on normal cases is very tightly closed, but during time of ovulation, it will open a little bit to allow sperm to go through. And then once embryo has successfully been implanted past the first trimester, the cervix is completely plugged by a mucus plug, and then that prevents bacteria from getting in. And then when it's time for baby to be born, the cervix will be open and what we call dilated to a certain point, up to 10 centimeters before the baby can fit through the birth canal, and out comes the birth of the baby. So cervix goes through, rounds of different sizes depending on menstrual cycle and an ovarian cycle, and whether you're pregnant or not and giving birth. And the vagina is a muscular elastic chamber for deposition of sperm, and also serve as a birth canal during childbirth. Now, we can't, not talk about mammary glands, even though it's not part of the reproductive system, but it is very important for survival of the offspring. Again, if you think about back from the caveman age, when there is no formula milk where we can buy from the supermarket, then they have to use their own milk, which is most convenient source of milk for their young. Even if you're thinking about mammals in the wild, that's the case, because of course animals can't go out and buy formula milk unless we humans intervene. But mammary glands serve a very important purpose of producing milk, and this process is induced by a hormone called prolactin. So this is the only place where I will talk about this hormone. Don't forget the function of this hormone. Um, because I won't get to that section all about the homeostasis of oxytocin and prolactin, all that stuff. It's just too much. So this is the only place where I'll say prolactin is an important hormone for production of milk, and is actually produced by your anterior pituitary gland. Okay, and then in order for us to eject milk, that's actually what we call milk letdown. That also is induced by another hormone called oxytocin. So don't mix up these two hormones. Prolactin is for producing lactose, so that's why it's called prolactin. It helps to produce milk. It has nothing to do with allowing the milk to come out. Okay, oxytocin is then the hormone that allows the milk to come out, be ejected outside, and the baby can drink. So this particular hormone is released by the posterior pituitary gland. Okay, so by the posterior pituitary gland is actually made by the hypothalamus, but we're not going to get there. Just released by the posterior pituitary gland is good enough. And this oxytocin will then do two things. When the mom is trying to give birth, she's in labor, it is this particular hormone that allows her uterus to contract. That's how a woman goes into labor. After the birth of the baby, oxytocin serves then another role, which is then for the ejection of mammary glands, where the milk is coming out of the mammary glands into the baby's mouth. All right, and then you have the process of human gametogenesis. So gametogenesis is Like I was telling, I always tell my students it's very easy to remember what is this process. Genesis means production of, generation of what? Gametes. So that's why it's called gametogenesis for production of gametes. And for males, they have spermatogenesis, so generation of sperm. For females, they have oogenesis, so generation of looks like a O, looks like a little egg. So that is for generation of egg. And then for spermatogenesis, you have to produce haploid sperm, of course, via meiosis. We already talked about that. And then it's continuous in adult males throughout their entire lifetime. There is no stopping to spermatogenesis once males reach their puberty. And hundreds of millions of sperm are produced each day. Now, why I mention these things about spermatogenesis is because they are different from oogenesis. And then cell division and maturation occur within the seminiferous tubules, where a single sperm takes about 7 weeks to go through the whole process of maturation before it's ready to be expelled out of the body. There's usually 4 products or 4 resulting cells of meiosis that will develop into mature sperm. I'll talk about that process over here in a bit. And then it occurs throughout adolescence and adulthood, which is what I said. It will continue throughout the male's lifetime. There's no stopping spermatogenesis. The only thing that can happen is there's less sperm produced as males age, but there's no stopping of spermatogenesis throughout their lifetime. Now, each spermatocyte divide by meiosis into 4 spermatids, which is why we have this 4 products here, where the spermatocyte will go from diploid 46 chromosomes in humans to haploid 23 chromosomes, spermatids. So spermatocyte have 46, spermatids have 23 chromosomes. This division right there is where meiosis happen to half the amount of chromosome to give you haploids. And then for males, they will produce mature sperm from precursor cells in a continuous sequence, which is different from females. So let's go through this continuous sequence. So for males, you start with some primordial germ cell within the embryo as, a baby boy. But when you get to puberty, testosterone starts to be made, and that's what triggers your spermatogonial stem cell to go through mitotic division to make what's called spermatogonium. Spermatogonium will then go through mitotic division to make what's called primary spermatocyte. Primary spermatocyte will then go through meiosis 1 and meiosis 2 to produce your secondary spermatocyte, which is why your secondary spermatocyte is considered as almost haploids until you get to spermatid. Okay, so spermatid is when then you have 23 chromosomes instead of 46. So that's why there's meiosis division. First meiosis division. I think that's a typo there. Maybe meiosis 1, not meiosis 2. Meiosis 1. First division. Oh wait, no, it is 1N, so it is 2. So maybe as a, not completed yet. So it becomes haploid, and then from there on becomes your spermatid haploids, because each of these spermatocyte will divide into your 2 daughter, quote unquote, daughter cells. And that's why you end up with 4 spermatid at the end, and then they will differentiate into your mature sperm cells. Okay, so that is the whole process of spermatogenesis. Make sure you know the names of these steps as well. And even though it's not bold underlined here, but I mentioned them here for a purpose. Okay, so you make sure you know it starts with spermatogonium, primary spermatocytes, and then secondary spermatocytes, spermatid, and become a mature sperm cells. You don't need to know, is it meiosis or is it meiosis 1 or 2? You don't need to know that. Okay, but just at least know that spermatogonium goes through mitosis, and then spermatocyte goes through meiosis. That's good enough for me. Okay. All right, so this is a quick animation that goes through that process really fast.
The testes constantly produce sperm, the male sex cells. Production begins within the seminiferous tubules, where stem cells, called spermatogonia, develop into immature sperm. Each 46 chromosome spermatogonium divides through mitosis to produce primary spermatocytes. These cells divide by meiosis to become 23 chromosome cells called secondary spermatocytes, then spermatids. This multi-step process, called spermatogenesis, produces the 23 chromosome immature sperm cells that mature in the epididymis.
And that's where they learn how to become motile.
The
All right,
testes.
we don't need to know that again. And then now you have female gametogenesis, which is called oogenesis. So compared to males before that, for oogenesis, they still produce haploid oocyte by meiosis, just like the males. Now, this is actually then a prolonged process in females compared to males. Males, they start producing sperm when they are, when they reach puberty and start making testosterone. But for females, the number amount of eggs that's produced, it's already done as a female baby. So this female baby as an embryo has already started to form all the eggs she will ever ovulate in her entire life. Okay, so that's something very different between females and males. Males don't start producing sperm until they reach puberty. Females, we already have all the eggs inside the uterus, inside the body, from the moment the baby is formed in her mother's womb. So this is why they say when a mom carries a daughter, she's technically carrying all her potential grandchild too. Is because all those potential oocytes are in there already forming within her baby girl. All right, so immature eggs form within the ovary of the female embryo. So this is, even though it starts, but it doesn't complete. So that's why it's a prolonged process, which is also something very different from males. Once males start spermatogenesis, it gets done. Okay, that's why they say one sperm takes about 7 weeks to be made. But for females, it's a lifelong process where, the eggs are formed when the embryo is being formed, but they kind of stop, and then they only complete if an egg is fertilized. So they don't complete development until years later. And we're completing development, meaning that it's only up to the secondary oocyte stage. It doesn't complete the entire process of meiosis, technically speaking, until fertilization. So another bizarre thing with oogenesis is that they don't produce equal amount of cells like sperm do. One spermatogonia or spermatid will become, spermatocyte will become four spermatids. But for egg cell is completely different. Cytokinesis during meiosis is actually unequal, where most of that cytoplasm of that one cell is segregated into a single daughter cell, a big single daughter cell. And then that will become your egg or oocytes. While the other little things that are kind of off to the side, as smaller part of the cytoplasm, form what's called polar bodies. And these, till this day, we don't know exactly what are they for, what function they serve, but they will degenerate. They form and then they degenerate. Kind of like how I'll talk about that in a bit, is that when a woman goes into her ovulation time, actually multiple follicles will mature, multiple eggs will mature, but only one will make it. So one will start to make it, grow and grow and grow until it bursts out of the ovary. The rest, they grow, and they stop and they degenerate. Okay, so this is all the same process of that. Same idea with female oogenesis. That is very different from male spermatogenesis. So mitotic divisions will occur in oogenesis, and they are completed before birth, because by the time you're born, you already have all the primary oocyte all in there. Okay, all the mitosis is done. And then production of mature eggs stop around 50 years old. That's another thing that's different from males. Males will continue to produce sperm throughout their entire lifetime. For females, this whole process of oogenesis will completely stop by the age of 50, which is when females reach menopause. Of course, that's an approximate age, average age. Different females will experience or reach menopause at different age level, but average is 50. And then once after menopause, everything stops. You no longer can produce oocytes. So produce a mature egg from precursor cells for females is a very long process with many interruptions. And then it's halts here, halts there. And then there's meiosis is actually not completed until fertilization. So if the egg is not fertilized, that egg have not completed meiosis. So this is why there, from primary oocytes, these are all that all the eggs that female will ever have, and then each month they will then have a maturation of secondary oocytes, which will be ovulated. And then they will only complete meiosis 2 if it becomes fertilized. So it's a, in a sense, the names is a little easier where you start with primordial germ cell of some sort 2, goes into oogonium, then you have your primary oocyte that's all present at birth, mitosis is done, and then each month, once female has reached their puberty stage, they will start to mature to form your secondary oocyte, which will then be ovulated one time each month. And if there's possible sperm around, it will be fertilized to complete the entire process of meiosis 2. Okay, again, I repeat, female eggs don't complete meiosis 2 until fertilization. Here's a quick animation video.
The ovaries produce secondary oocytes, the female sex cells. During fetal development, stem cells, called oogonia, go through mitosis. Some of these cells develop into 46 chromosome primary oocytes. At the onset of female puberty, tens of thousands of primary oocytes each form part of a primordial follicle in the ovaries. Between menarche and menopause, each primordial follicle develops into a mature follicle and its primary oocyte completes meiosis 1. Some primary oocytes become secondary oocytes, 23 chromosome cells that begin meiosis 2, then pause. Each month, one secondary oocyte is released into the uterine tube.
Bursts open.
Meiosis 2 is completed when the oocyte is fertilized.
And
the resulting ovum can develop into a zygote.
So notice that last stage, you see how that there's like a dozen sperm at least that's trying to dig into the egg cell. That's what I was talking about. It takes multiple sperm to try to dig in order for one sperm to make it. And I apologize for this. I forgot to change that to oogenesis. All right, so hormonal regulation of reproduction. We kind of going along that theme here where we end the system with some hormones that regulate that particular system. For mammalian reproduction, is kind of complicated in terms of reproduction. There are hormones from 3 different places. You have hormones that are from the hypothalamus, those from anterior pituitary gland, as well as the gonads themselves. So at the top of the chain, you have the hypothalamus that release a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. So they stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to release some gonadotropins. These 2 gonadotropins are called follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So both of these hormones are released by the anterior pituitary gland to stimulate something within the gonads to do something. So for males and females, of course, they trigger different things. For follicle stimulating hormone, or known as FSH, the males will be induce for the Sertoli cells, which is a type of nurse cells that will nourish the developing sperm, and they will become mature sperm within the seminiferous tubules. So this is why I say it's I always say it's kind of easy to remember what FSH does. FSH kind of spells like fish, and what does fish do? They swim. So they swim just like sperm cells do. So that's why FSH for males is for maturation of sperm cells, whereas luteinizing hormone, LH, for males is to stimulate their Leydig cells within the seminiferous tubules. Not within the seminiferous tubules. They're kind of around, but they're still within the testicles, to produce testosterone and also other androgens. Androgens defined as other male sex hormones. And then for females, what do those 2 things do? So just like FSH is for sperm maturation, FSH for females is also for follicle maturation, which means the oocyte can then be developed fully. They also stimulate the secretion of estradiol, which is the estrogen hormone for a female, just like how we have testosterone for androgen. You have estradiol for estrogen for females. And then for LH, what does it stimulate in females? LH stimulate ovulation, not maturation of egg. That's FSH. LH is for ovulation of the egg, and also for corpus luteum to form. I'll talk about what corpus luteum do in a bit. All right, then the 2 sex hormone is then produced by your gonads. Okay, so for testosterone is only for males, produced by testes. Female actually do make testosterone. It's just that we make very, very little of it. For males, it is all made by your testicles, and it is a type of androgen, which is a male sex hormone for production of many, many different things. I'm just going to summarize it as male secondary sex characteristics, development of that. Okay. For estradiol, it is an estrogen, which is a female sex hormone produced by the ovaries for female secondary sex characteristics. So I'm just simplifying into those things. And then progesterone is a third hormone, or second hormone produced by females, mainly. In this case, is produced by a structure called the corpus luteum, which I was talking about in right here. Formation of corpus luteum is actually a little structure that forms within the ovaries for it to produce hormone progesterone. What is progesterone important for? Progesterone is an important hormone for maintaining the endometrium lining to be thick so that when you have a potential pregnancy, that embryo can implant into the lining. If there's no progesterone, that's what triggers menstruation. So when you don't have progesterone, uterine will get rid of that blood. Now you don't have any thick endometrium lining. The embryo comes by, cannot implant, it will just come right out. So, or if you get it was at the right point where progesterone is just decreasing, which causes spasm of the uterus, that will also eject the baby. So, which is why it is very critical for keeping the endometrium lining thick for potential pregnancy. Second thing progesterone is for is to keep the pregnancy within the uterus. It's what's important for. So it prevents or inhibits the uterus from doing any type of muscular spasm to eject the blood that's in there. So once the baby has reached past the first trimester, corpus luteum actually degenerates, and then the placenta will take over the job of making progesterone to make sure the baby stays within the uterus. And last thing I want to end with this chapter is the coordination of ovarian cycle and uterine cycle. Again, it's a very complicated process, but I'll simplify it because I want to make sure you understand that it's a, in order for a successful pregnancy, you need to have coordination between these two cycles. For females, we have ovarian cycle and uterine cycle. Ovarian cycle is where the follicle mature for an oocyte to be released. Uterine cycle is also known as your menstrual cycle, which is only in charge of keeping your endometrium lining either thick or thin by shedding that blood off. So if the oocyte is not fertilized, it will then be shed off so we can have a complete new fresh layer of lining in the next cycle ready for the next oocyte to be released and keep it all fresh for that oocyte to implant for the embryo to form. Now these two cycles must be linked so that hormone activity synchronize ovulation with the uterine lining establishment that is perfect for embryo to implant and develop. So ovarian cycle has three phases. First, you have what's called the follicular phase, where the follicles mature and grow in order for the egg to grow. So follicle cells are kind of like the helper cells that nourish the egg. So this is from day 0 to 14. Ovulation happens in the middle of the cycle. If you're thinking about an average of 28-day cycle, that will be around day 14. The oocyte will then be released from the ovary. The ovary actually ruptures, eject the egg out, and then it goes into luteal phase. The ovaries will then produce corpus luteum so that it can secrete progesterone, telling your uterus, hey, don't go through spasms yet. We have an egg coming. It may be fertilized and it may need to implant. And then uterine cycle goes in sync with ovarian cycle. So here's ovarian cycle, here's uterine cycle, and this is the timing of it going across the x-axis here. So that when you do, while you are in, that follicular phase, there's no egg in the uterus yet. So now as the uterine cycle goes through menstrual flow first, let's get rid of that old blood from last month and we can rebuild with new blood again, new nutrients ready for the baby to, or, fertilized oocyte to come through. So that's why it goes while the ovarian is in follicular phase, uterine cycle is already in menstrual flow and starting to be in proliferative phase, starting to rebuild all those arteries, all those nutrients. Once the egg is ovulated, menstrual cycle should now be in secretory phase, where it's really, releasing all those nutrients within the endometrium lining just in case there's an embryo that needs to implant. So that's why once after ovulation, secretory phase should be there. While it's thick, your luteal phase is what produces the progesterone to keep your endometrium lining thick, keep your uterus in secretory phase so you don't go into menstrual cycle again. menstrual flow phase, because once there's no fertilization of any sort, corpus luteum will then degenerate, progesterone comes down, which then will trigger your uterus to start to spasm, shed the old blood off, and rebuild all over again, which is why you have to have syncing of the ovarian cycle with uterine cycle in order to have a successful pregnancy. Here's a quick video that goes over that whole process in animated
The
form.
menstrual cycle begins with menstrual bleeding, marking the follicular phase's first day. When the follicular phase begins, levels of estrogen and progesterone are low. As a result, the top layer of the uterus's thickened lining break down and are shed, and menstrual bleeding occurs. About this time, the pituitary gland starts sending follicle-stimulating hormones to your ovaries, stimulating the development of 5 to 20 follicles in the ovaries. Each follicle contains an immature egg and produces estrogen. One follicle
only one
will
makes
soon begin
it.
to grow faster than others. This is called the dominant follicle. As the follicle grows, the levels of estrogen in the blood rise significantly. This increase in estrogen begins to inhibit the secretion of the follicle-stimulating hormone. The fall in follicle-stimulating hormone allows smaller follicles to die off. They are, in effect, starved of follicle-stimulating hormone. The increasing amount of estrogen in your body also ensures that the lining of your womb thickens with nutrients and blood. This is so that if you do get pregnant, the fertilized egg will have everything it needs to grow. The ovulatory phase begins with a rise in the levels of luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. The surge of the luteinizing hormone triggers one of the most prominent follicles to pop open and release its egg,
Just like that.
which heads into the fallopian tube and starts its journey towards the uterus.
See all those cilia?
Ovulation usually occurs 16 to 32 hours after the beginning of the surge, around day 14 of the menstrual cycle. During the luteal phase, the levels of the luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone decrease. The ruptured follicle closes after releasing the egg and forms a corpus luteum, which produces estrogen and progesterone, which causes the lining of the uterus to thicken even more. If an egg is fertilized, progesterone supports early pregnancy. But if no fertilization occurs, the corpus luteum will break down between 9 and 11 days after ovulation. This results in a drop in estrogen and progesterone levels, bringing us back to the first stage of menstruation if no pregnancy has occurred.
Okay, so that's the animation view of that, and that's all I have for you for chapter 46. I'm 6 minutes over of what I promised, but just a little bit more because I wanted to talk to you about discuss those things I wanted to talk about. So, last practice questions, and then we'll be done. An advantage of internal fertilization over external fertilization is that internal fertilization prevents drying out of the gametes in the dry environment. That's the advantage it has, that adaptation advantage it has over external. Spermatogenesis and oogenesis differ in that they differ a lot of things. So A and D, oogenesis produce one haploid cell, and spermatogenesis produce 4. And oogenesis produce one egg, and spermatogenesis produces 4 sperm. Oogenesis begins at onset of puberty. Incorrect, because it is when it actually happens while the embryo is still in the mother's womb. Spermatogenesis begins in embryonic stage. Incorrect, so these two should have been switched, and then they will be all correct. A blood sample taken from a woman in her 40s showing high levels of estrogen, progesterone, HCG, which is the human chorionic gonadotropin, and then prolactin suggests that. So this hormone I didn't talk about because we didn't talk about development of the baby, but this is usually what is detected in pregnancy tests because this hormone is produced by the embryo itself. So once the embryo starts making this hormone, this is what triggers and tells your body, hey, you're pregnant and you need to keep that baby in the womb. So this, when a woman have all these hormones in there, she is pregnant. In humans, oogenesis is completed once the sperm penetrates the oocyte, fertilization, no other time. This is the only time when oogenesis can be completed, is when the oocyte is fertilized by a sperm. What is the function of follicle stimulating hormone in male? Remember, what did I say? Easy way to remember. FSH means kind of spells like fish. So it is something to do with sperm production, maturation of sperm by stimulating these Sertoli helper cells or nursing cells that nourish the sperm. What is a variation in sexual reproduction that takes place as a result of death of the last male blue head wrasse in a harem? It is the largest female will transform into a male producing sperm. Why was the caribou birth rate in Greenland plummeted 75% since 1993? Is because the average spring temperatures in calving grounds cause earlier plant sprouting that caused the unsynchrony or unsynchronized of the calves migrating to the right, or excuse me, the caribou migrating to the right area at the right timing. So they were the nursing moms were malnourished. And that's all I have for you for chapter 46. Thank you, and I hope you have enjoyed this semester.